This primer is intended for new reviewers or anyone interested in learning more about the peer review process as carried out by the American Journal of Physiology. Peer review is an important obligation and part of the academic process. It's the best way to ensure quality control and provide a mechanism so that the best science is published. This flowchart shows the distribution of papers after they're submitted to the American Journal of Physiology office. The author submits a manuscript, which is generally evaluated in approximately 1 day by the APS Publications Office for various quality control issues, including signatures and forms that need to be submitted along with the electronic manuscript. The paper is then sent to the editor-in-chief, who evaluates the suitability of the paper for publication in his or her journal. Sometimes a paper can be triaged without review if it doesn't fit the journal's publication policy. This happens very infrequently and is usually done with the consultation of at least one or more associate editors. For most of the papers, however, the editor-in-chief assigns the paper to an associate editor, who then goes on to invite between 3 and 10 potential reviewers in order to secure 3 reviewers for the manuscript. This takes approximately 2 days. After the 3 reviewers are secured, all other invited reviewers are sent notifications that they are no longer needed. The reviewers are asked to return papers, their critiques that is, within 14 days. In the case of rapid reports, this is reduced to 10 days. After the critiques are received by the associate editor, they are evaluated, and the associate editor then makes a decision as to the disposition of the paper. This can take between 1 and 2 days. There are 3 decisions that potentially can be made with a paper. First, it can be rejected outright because there are major flaws in the science and a lack of enthusiasm by the reviewers. The second disposition of the paper is to ask for either major or minor revisions. The associate editor then will summarize the revisions that the reviewers requested to be made and send the paper back to the author. The author then is given a 90-day time limit to make these revisions, and it is sent back to the AJP editorial office. The first revision is always sent to the original reviewers. However, if there's a second revision, then the associate editor determines which reviewers need to see the paper again to satisfy their concerns. Finally, the paper may be accepted, and if so, would be published online within a very short period of time. Other possible associate editor decisions relate to rejection with an option to resubmit as a new manuscript. This doesn't happen very often, but it may happen if papers are deemed interesting and the associate editor wants to encourage reworking of the study. This usually takes major effort. Another potential decision on a paper is to reject with referral to Physiological reports. This is a sister journal with the Physiological Society of Great Britain and is an online open access journal. If the authors agree to refer the paper to Physiological reports, the reviews will accompany that paper, and the editorial staff of Physiological Reviews will decide whether that paper should be published in their journal. Then finally, there may be a rejection without the option to resubmit. That is, that under no circumstances is the journal interested in seeing another version of this paper. So who gets to review an article? It's considered an honor and quite prestigious for you to be asked to review a scientific manuscript. This endeavor is used as documentation for your international reputation in a given field. It will be considered by promotion and tenure committees as well as new position interviews. Generally, recognized experts in the field are asked to review. Junior reviewers can review if they're under the supervision of a mentor. If a junior reviewer is asked to review by a primary reviewer, then the editor-in-chief needs to be notified. Some journals maintain a list of junior reviewers who are up and coming in a field that they consider exceptionally conscientious in reviewing a paper. Approximately 30% of the reviews are entered by editorial board members who are experts in various fields of each journal. The number of editorial members varies between 50 and 100 depending upon the journal. Potential reviewers are also recommended by authors. Authors are allowed to recommend up to 4 reviewers of people they feel knowledgeable in the field that can review. There are also the option to recommend reviewers that should not review the paper because of undue bias or prejudice. Importantly, reviewers are asked to decline if there's a real or perceived conflict of interest. So somebody at the same institution or somebody with a bias in a certain way, or somebody that is a personal friend of an author should decline to review. Or if they cannot review in a timely manner, if travel or other obligations prevent them from reviewing within 2 weeks, they're asked to decline the invitation for review. Or certainly, if the content is outside of their area of expertise, they should decline to review, and if so, recommend other people that they feel could be qualified to review this paper. This is very helpful for the associate editor. In order to be selected to review a paper, especially for young people, it is important that you and your work are known if you wish to be considered as a manuscript reviewer. You should obtain experience early in your training by asking your mentor to help review papers. Be sure he or she lets the editor know that you've helped. The better your reviews are, the more you will be asked to evaluate papers. At some point, you can request the editor of a given journal to consider you as a reviewer. Eventually, you may be considered for membership on the editorial board, and if you have superb expertise, maybe even an associate editor down the line. You should network as much as possible, talk with editorial board members, and ask people to review you as potential reviewer of a given area. Most importantly, you need to do a good job when you review. Editors like to assign papers to people that are conscientious, helpful, and provide constructive feedback to the authors. There's no real one way to approach a review. Here are some recommendations for the novice reviewer that will help evaluate the most important components of a scientific manuscript. Negative findings may be important, but one needs to be sure they are not related to a type 2 statistical error. You have to ask yourself these potential questions. Is the paper within the scope of the journal, generally assessed by the EIC at submission time? Does the paper address an interesting and important and potentially novel question? We don't want to encourage the submission of Me Too papers. Are there surprising novel findings that could lead the field in a new direction? Paradigm-changing experiments are always the best to publish and have the biggest impact. And finally, are there new or novel methodologies that this paper brings to the forefront? While there's no one way to review a paper, here are some recommendations for the novice reviewer that will help evaluate most of the important components of a scientific manuscript. Is the manuscript readable? Is the scientific approach appropriate for answering this question? Are there obvious omissions? Are the conclusions supported by the data? Are the statistics appropriate? Now, if the paper is rejected, it is particularly important to address these questions. Remember again that negative findings may be important and sometimes quite valid, but shouldn't be dismissed out of hand. As data reproducibility becomes a bigger issue, negative findings will take on more and more importance in the field. First, get a sense of the overall importance and methodology of the study. You can use the abstract and figures to help with this without reading all of the fine detail in the manuscript. Some people read the abstract first. Some people go right to the figures and the legends and then go to the conclusions and the discussion. If you get a sense that this is an important, interesting paper, then I would get down to the small details and read the paper verbatim with the in-depth evaluation. When doing an in-depth evaluation, here are some several questions you should keep in mind as you go through each section of the manuscript. So be sure to read the entire paper. Pay attention to the details, especially the methodological details and the experimental protocol. As you move through the results and figures, you can ask, is the question as stated in the introduction actually being addressed by the methods and protocols being used? In other words, is the study designed correctly? Do the data support the conclusion? And under this, is the quality of the data sufficient to enable conclusions to be drawn? Is the experimental design appropriate? Are non-relevant data presented? Sometimes they belong in a different paper. Do tables and figures duplicate the findings, which is the better format? Consider the possibility of a type 2 false negative error from underpowered studies, and this can be garnered from the detailed description in the methods. There are several issues to keep in mind when writing your reviews. First, you should synthesize comments about the manuscript and study that are specific to the editor, associate editor. These comments should focus on the importance and novelty of the study. Does it add substantially to our understanding of a process, or are the data just incremental? You can also indicate any issues you may have with the writing and, of course, any ethical issues that you are concerned about. It is important that you don't just copy and paste the same comments that you make to the author. Finally, be sure that your overall evaluation of the manuscript is consistent with your review. Comments to authors should be different from those provided to the editors. Here's a list of details that should be thought of to enhance your review. So what are the things that make a poor review? It's important to remember that your review should be written in a direct, constructive, and scholarly way. Sentence should be phrased in such a way as not to degrade or belittle the authors. Specific issues concerning interpretation of data or discussion points should include pertinent references when necessary. You are not obligated to reanalyze or redraw the data, but you can make suggestions that the authors should do. Finally, remember that your review needs to be written as well as you want the manuscript to be written. So go over the review for spelling errors, good grammar, and proofread your review before you send it to the associate editor. Good reviews are very helpful to the authors and ultimately result in better science. In a good review, you will comment on strengths and weaknesses. It is okay to be complimentary. You can comment on the experimental design, the area and its importance, the novelty, etc. If necessary, and with justification, you can recommend that additional studies need to be done if there are gaping holes in data that are critical. You should divide your comments into major and minor issues. If more work is needed to answer the question the authors posed, you can propose that. If more studies would answer different next step questions, generally do not propose that. In other words, don't ask authors to do more than is absolutely necessary to draw good conclusions from the data. Other issues that you may comment on to the authors can relate to the presentation of the data and to the writing style. Comment on the rationale and hypotheses. Do the data justify the conclusions? And does the discussion provide a synthesis of new ideas? You can ask the authors for major reorganization of the presentation or reanalysis of the data. This, of course, implies that a major revision is necessary. Each journal has a slightly different evaluation and reviewer form. This is just one screenshot to show you what it might look like. Here are examples from AJP of the kind of information editors are asked to provide to reviewers in order to best evaluate the acceptability of the manuscript. Note here the overall rating of the manuscript, the significance of the research findings, the novelty, and the experimental design are all asked to be evaluated. And then a final recommendation, including referral to physiological reports, is asked to be entered prior to the individual comments of the review. Here's another screenshot that indicates additional questions that reviewers are asked to evaluate, such things as IACUC and IRB approval. Has that been entered into the manuscript, and is that clearly stated? Any questions of APS's guiding principles for the care and use of animals, which should be in the methods section of every paper. And is the manuscript too long, too wordy? Suggestions for shortening components of the manuscript can be made by the viewer. In addition, are all the figures necessary? Is the use of color scientifically necessary? Remember, APS members get free color, but not all figures really justify color. Although with online publication, there's really very little cost to doing color now, and that may be reevaluated in the future. And then, of course, the individual comments, as we said earlier, to the reviewing editor or the associate editor in this case, and comments that you want to go directly to the author. Remember that the associate editor will read your comments and may have the opportunity to modify them if you indicate anything that he or she believes is inappropriate to transmit to the authors. Data supplements are commonplace in many journals, even though published online only. However, data supplements must be appropriate. As a reviewer, you're responsible for also reviewing the data supplements, whether they expanded methods, videos, long data sets, or software code. You should evaluate whether any of the supplemental material would be better suited as part of the main manuscript. For AJP journals, where there are no page limitations, authors are encouraged to provide all relevant figures and tables in the body of the manuscript. It is up to the editor to determine if a given set of supplementary data is necessary. These guidelines may be changing in the future as new rules and regulations for the methodological details are implemented by funding bodies. Please refer to some of the online material for more about data supplements. Please remember that the goal of the review process is to make science better. The published record of a set of experiments should be believable and should have been conducted with the rigor that will allow the data and conclusions to be upheld, given the current level of technology. In this way, as a reviewer, you are contributing to the scientific record for many years to come. A good reviewer is a consultant to the authors. The goal should be to improve the paper at hand, not make it into a different study. Point out missing controls or studies needed to interpret the data. Evaluate clarity of the presentation, style, and order. If you suggest further studies, are they really necessary before the conclusions can be made? Do the suggested additional studies fit within the scope of the work, or would they lead to a major expansion? And finally, can the studies be done within the 90-day revision window? In other words, new animal studies using a 6-month treatment are not realistic to request. Here are some take-home messages concerning manuscript reviewing. Indicate the major strengths and weaknesses of the study for the authors, including the novelty, but independent of the writing style. Include references to support your comments when appropriate. Suggest changes to improve the science of the study. Comment on the grammar or syntax if certain phrases should be revised. Comment on the statistics. Are they appropriate? And finally, provide helpful comments to the editor in complete thoughts, telling what you really think and why. When manuscripts are reviewed or revised, the authors provide a version of the manuscript where the major changes are usually designated by red text. This may vary depending on journal guidelines. In addition, a separate document is provided where the authors respond to the concerns of each reviewer on a point-by-point basis. As a reviewer, you should evaluate how responsive the authors have been to your concerns. Did they respond in a measured scientific way? Did they carry out additional analyses or experiments as recommended? If they did not, do they present a convincing argument? Why not? Finally, it is important that you understand that there are likely to be differences of opinions between you and the authors and the other reviewers for that matter. The editor must make a decision based on the abundance of evidence in one or another direction. It is your responsibility as a reviewer to make your argument as strong as possible. Your opinion may be a minority opinion, and the final decision may not be to your liking. But this is the role of the associate editor and editor. Revised manuscripts should be given a high priority of review and should be easier to evaluate than the original submission. If you are new at the reviewing process, make sure you document this activity and discuss with your chair at your annual evaluation, because this will be taken into account for promotion, tenure, and other activities at your institution and during your career. Reviewing is an obligation and can be a major career building. Here are some final thoughts. Contributing to the peer review process is an important part of a successful career. Experience gained as a peer reviewer will help you in your own writing and your revising of manuscripts and grants for that matter. Good reviewers are hard to find, and editors really appreciate careful, considered, and concise reviews that are helpful to authors. And recognize that the editors grade your performance as a reviewer. If you are repeatedly asked to review for an APS journal, you must be doing a good job. Here are some additional references where you can find more detailed information that may be helpful in the review process.